guys with this, but I want you to know, be rest assured that we've tested this. Okay, so we've really looked at staff with flexible roles, so those counselors, administrators, people not tied to a classroom, and we're able to train them on this, again, for students with more mild to moderate problem behaviors. Okay, we actually determined the efficacy and acceptability. All of them who endured my trainings actually walked away from it saying, I'd actually would do this. And some people who I actually thought would not said they would actually do this. They actually did do it and actually did it well. And so even for those people that aren't big fans of FBA, they found the methods to be acceptable. Okay, and we did 3 phases to test this. So we did a pre and a post test. So you guys won't be convinced that I just trained the choir, right? So they actually came in not having very much FBA, not much knowledge in FBA. Then in the second phase, we actually sent them off after 4 hours. Said, go ahead. I didn't even talk to them after that. Go ahead. Don't come back to me until you're done with your FBA. And so they used the materials that we gave them, came up with a summary. Then once they finished that, I looked at what they did, worked with the actual student by using functional analysis, and really tested through experimental methods to see if what they said was correct. So they had nothing to do with this part. I was then testing what they were doing by working one-on-one with the student for multiple sessions, and we tested to see if what they said was right. So one, we see that the training worked, taught them something. They went from 40% to about 93%. So at least they learned. They said all of the things were acceptable in the training, that they felt equipped. They would actually use it again. They definitely would suggest it to others. They thought the tools were easy to use. And again, these are counselors, teachers, administrators, principals who didn't have very much time for this. That they liked using the teacher facts, and they would use that again. We teach about the student facts. What you'll notice in the training is we don't spend too much time on that because it's very much like the teacher facts. And most of them did not use it, but they still said that they actually would use it for older students. The ABC form, they said was acceptable. They feel that they are now able to inform interventions based on what they did. They felt that the time to conduct the FBA and go through the trainings was reasonable, and overall benefit was acceptable. And so we then went back and tested those FBAs by looking at what they did, what they came up with for their hypothesis. And one, I first started to look at just their interviews. If they stopped at just the interview, because that's a common practice in the world today. I don't know if those of you are familiar with it, but some people just do the interview form and then come up with an intervention based on that, just to be fast about it. Well, if they stopped there based on our trainings, 8 out of 10 of them actually would have got it right if they stopped there, okay? But what's interesting though, is because we taught them to ask and see, those 2 that didn't get it right just from the interview, when they went to go and observe, changed their hypothesis based on their observation. And actually, that was correct. So all 10 out of 10 that we tested experimentally came up with the right hypothesis for that. So it's important to urge people to not just interview and go ahead and come up with an intervention. That's good. And if you're well trained, you might get it right 80% of the time. But really to go and see what's going on within those environments. And I don't know if we'll always get 10 out of 10. We didn't test that rigorously, but we do know that these 10 out of 10 were able to do that, okay? The last session that we just added, the racer, or we modified, we always had it, but we modified it a little bit. We then taught that in isolation to a number of about 361 people. Okay, so in 60 minutes, we taught that last session. And what we saw, and these were very different populations. Some of them were behavior specialists. Some of them were teachers. We actually had the same results across the board. And they started with 55% on our pre-test and ended with 85% in our post-test. And so in 60 minutes time, they were able to come up with those critical features for a behavior support plan. Okay? So you guys are convinced this can work? You don't feel like I just gave you a bunch of papers that aren't tested or based on research, right? So good. I want to familiarize you with the forms and the quick reference guide. And that's pages 78 through 108. And so you don't have to go to the activities within the training to go back and do this, but there are blank forms of the facts, the ABC recording forms, as well as the behavior support planning forms. As well as if you go to the website, you'll be able to get those in Word or PDF version and use them. The quick reference guide is for once you've trained somebody, say, hey, just go back to pages 92 through 108, or I sometimes just hand that out for them to remember. Because it's a task analysis, a step-by-step guide, just in case they forgot from the trainings, on how to ask the interview, how to conduct the interview, how to do the ABC observation, and how to come up with behavior support plans that are based on the function. And so it's a quick reference, kind of Cliff Notes version to the other 100 pages that I have in the manual. Okay? All right, so within the next 20 to 30 minutes before our break, I want to unpack these sessions a little bit more. Okay, I gave you a quick version, but I want to unpack them a little bit more and walk through the highlights of each session so you guys will feel like you understand more on that. So in part 1, pages 7 through 17, you can follow along here as we go through. I'm going to skip some parts just to keep it fast. But remember, our objective is to teach them how to define the what of behavior and come up with the where, when, and why. Okay? And by the end of this, they're going to find a buddy, teacher, to then start the process. So we teach them DASH, okay, and teach them that in this process we're going to define, ask, see, and hypothesize. And you guys all have that down by now, right? But also by the end of that first session, your participants will have that down. That how do you do an FBA? Well, we define, ask, see, and hypothesize. And I have to follow those steps because Sheldon said, if not, I'll only get it 80% right? So, and you'll tell them that these are going to be the different parts that we're going to go through. And however you're going to break up your training, if it's going to be one part and then a break a week or so, or if you're going to combine some parts, and some people have done that, and we'll talk about that when we get to the action planning. Now we teach the idea that we always start with the behavior. Even though it's called ABCs, we start with the B first. That's our focal point, okay? So we have to define the what. Then the next step is we want to know the where and when of that what. So we think of those as the common terminology we use are the routine and the antecedents. Okay? And then we want to find out the why, the outcome of the behavior. So what happens right after it occurs. So we teach, this is where we start. We start with the behavior, and it helps participants that aren't well versed in FBA to understand that the student does what? So that's the what. The student does what? And then after that, what is the antecedent trigger? So when something occurs, the student does what? And then, of course, completing that sentence. So when X happens, the student does what? Because, and what happens right after that. And that process, for the most part, has helped teachers to really get a grasp of the ABCs. I don't know what the magic is behind that, but really the when, what, and because has really helped them to really see, oh, wow, that's what's going on with the student. So that's the way we teach it. We teach them how to define behavior in observable and measurable terms. But the basic rule, because those get lost on a lot of people, is the behavior defined so clearly that a person unfamiliar with the student could recognize the behavior without any doubts? Could they walk into your classroom and say, oh, Johnny's being disruptive right now, based on what Sheldon told me? Can they do that? If not, you haven't defined it well enough. We teach them how to come up with examples of what disruption or a talk out is, so that person observing actually knows what that looks like. We also teach them to identify non-examples. So when is a talk out not occurring? For example, when there's group activities, that's not a talk out. That's not a problem for me. When they're out at recess and he's yelling and stuff, that's actually not a problem because it's okay to yell at recess. So we really teach them to identify the examples and non-examples of what that problem behavior is, if that helps them. But the main message is you want it to be defined so clearly. And so if they're having a hard time with that, say, well, give me an example, and then write that down. Give me what you wouldn't count as a talk out, and write that down. And then getting to this point. And that helps them to really see that. And so we do activities for each session. One of the first activities we do is, before we even teach this concept, we say, list the 5 problem behaviors that occur in your school or your classroom. And give them 30 seconds. Ready, set, go. And they write it down in their sheet. And then we ask them, okay, were those observable and measurable? Can anybody else go in there to see that problem behavior? And we have a number of other practice opportunities for them. We say Johnny is disruptive. I think you guys see it in activity 2 and page 9. Good. And we really walk them through and practice demystifying some of these behaviors to get them to see that they need to be concrete. Okay? And after we do that, we then move on to the where and when. So after that what, we really teach them to say what happens right before that behavior. And so we jump into activity 3, and we start, every step of the way now is working on building that summary statement, and we scaffold that process. And so right now we're saying, when he goes to math class and peers tease him about his walk, AJ talks or calls them names and hits them. All right, what do we always start with, everybody? We start with the behavior, right? So guess what we're gonna do? The behavior. The student does what? What is he doing? He's calls them names and hits them. Great. Now we're gonna look before. What happens right before that? Well, it's during going to math class and when peers tease him about his walk. So you see what we do right there, right? 1, we get them to focus on, great, I'm glad you saw this sentence, but what's the behavior? Think about that first. Write that in there. Then tell me what happens right before that, and the where and the when. Okay, and so you do a number of activities just like that. And once you've done that, we then start to teach about the why. And we call that the outcome, thinking about because. And so we break this down into 2 steps, because a lot of people want to jump right in and say, well, it's because of this or because of that. And we say, whoa. Okay, we need to base it on what we see. Okay? So the first step is, I want you to tell me what happens right afterwards. Okay, and not an interpretation of what happens right afterwards. What you see happens right afterwards. Okay? And so we have a number of examples that we walk through of during recess when peers tease him, Ben hits his peers, and they leave him alone. Leave him alone is where we're going to write in for the C part. And we walk through a number of activities that actually helps them to see. Don't jump into, oh, it's because he's avoiding their attention. We're not there yet. We need all the A and the B and the C in order to come up with that. So the first step, just tell me what happens right afterwards. And so we practice this, right? Joe throws his pencil and rips his paper during math. Whenever he's given double-digit math problems, this results in him getting sent to the office. All right, group, what do we do first? Define the behavior, right? Student does what? Throws his pencil and rips the paper. Okay, what's our next step? What do? We look at what happens right before that. So the routine is during math class when what? When given double-digit math problems. Great work. Now there's the last part. We just learned about this, okay? So what happens right afterwards? Did you guys say sent to the office? All right. You didn't say, well, because he wants attention from the teacher or because he hates math or... No, right? You just said what you saw there. And then the second step then is we go into the why. But we teach them to look at the whole sentence, if you want to think of it that way, all the A and the B and the C before they get to that function. And so we then say, now I want you to think from the student's perspective. What is the payoff of these ABCs? Okay, what's going on here? What are they getting from this? And what is the most important thing that student wants to gain or avoid? And so we practice making summary statements, and we add this last part here. So after we've come up with the sentence, then we come up with the statement, therefore, the function of the behavior is to, and they have to choose get or avoid. and then specifically what do they get or avoid, and that's what's taught in this last session. We teach the idea that functions of behavior are either to get or avoid something, and that's the first question we ask. And then what is that they're gaining or avoiding? Is it sensory, social, or tangible? And if it's sociable, specifically, and of course for all of these specifically, what is it? Okay? But we replace the terminology of function, because it bores people, is really what is the payoff of the problem behavior, and really getting them to think from the lens of the student. And so that's the big piece in the 4 parts of this training, is 1, getting them to think through the eyes of the learner, and then of course to be an investigator that's convinced. And I commonly use the analogy of, CSI or who your favorite investigators are, and you need to be convinced of what's going on here. So of course we use some cartoons, we use some videos to show this, but we even practice for what's the function of this student's behavior, right? And so looks like obviously he's enjoying this here, so doesn't look like he's trying to avoid it, right? So we use those within the training, and of course come up with final hypothesis statements. And we have scenarios that they go through. So after interviewing Mr. Smith and conducting several observations of Johnny in the 3rd grade classroom, the team determined that during less structured class time, free time, cooperative group, art projects, etc., Johnny tears up his paper and stomps his feet. After Johnny engages in this behavior, his peers laugh at him. And again, we practice what's the behavior, tears up the paper and stomps his feet. What happens before that? Well, first of all, we have to know where to go. It's a 3rd grade classroom, and it's a less structured class time, and we've actually defined that a little bit more there. What's the outcome? What happens right after it? Peers laugh at him. Therefore, the function of the behavior is to get peer attention. And so we practice a number of scenarios like that, and that's basically where the session ends. You're encouraged to have them complete the checks for understanding, so that I know they've had a lot of help from their buddies and yourself during that training. Now we want to see if they can do this independently. Can they identify what dash is? Can they come up with summary statements here and understand the ABCs? And of course, we want them from this point on to think we always start with the problem behavior and look at that. We have them break down, coming up with a problem behavior that they've encountered, and give some examples and non-examples of, now if I wanted to go into your classroom and see it, tell me what those are, to really get them to really think of how to unpack those problem behaviors. And of course, these are the key points to that first training. Any questions about part 1? I know I flew through those 17 pages or so, but no? All right. Well, then we're going to start unpacking session 2 then. All right? Or part 2 here. And we're going to talk about investigating behavior. So of course you're going to review the objectives and the content from that first session. We're going to then introduce model and practice, doing the facts interview, and constructing behavior statements from this. They're going to walk away from this getting ready to go ahead and do it with that buddy teacher who has a student with some problem behaviors. You noticed in the beginning that I only talked about the ABCs, the antecedent, behavior, and consequence. In this second session, we start to introduce the idea of setting events. So we don't do that in the first session, because we really want people to focus on the problem behavior and then look around that. When we get into setting events, and those are things that are outside of what we see in the environment that could be affecting the behavior, people tend to get derailed and start talking about how the student's parents aren't good, or that he needs to be on meds, or whatever it is. We don't want to engage in that. We really want them to see what's going on in that situation. Now, we do think setting events are important, and we need to identify them. And we teach setting events as kind of like what we have for, what's his name, Bob. Can you guys all read this? It says, well, it's a delicate situation, sir. Sophisticated firing system, hair trigger mechanisms, and Bob's wife just left him last night, so you know his mind's not into this. Okay, it's the bomb squad here. And we teach setting events very much like this. Before today, Bob had somebody to go home to. Okay? Well, today is a different story. and he has to defuse the bomb, and he may not be as motivated as he was yesterday to defuse that bomb, right? And so we're putting our hands and asking him to do something very strenuous when there's some other things that may be affecting how he performs today. And so we really teach setting events that way, of those infrequent events that actually affect the outcome. So the idea that there's something outside, me getting into a fight on the bus, or whatever it might be, that might make me want to escape math so much more right now, okay? Or me breaking up with my girlfriend, or whatever it is, if I'm in high school, makes me want to now get more attention, or whatever it may be, right? So I might be more of a class clown today than I normally am. And so really thinking about what are those setups, what are those infrequent events, and tying that to the outcome. It's more likely to get them there really fast, okay? We then, of course, review the antecedent of those preceding events that trigger the problem. We want those observable behaviors of concern, and of course, the consequence and outcome are those following events that maintain the behaviors of concern. We teach then the facts, and you'll see those in Appendix A and B. We teach about the staff, and then we help them to generalize to the student, because it's very much the same format with more simplified language. The facts has two parts, parts A and parts B. We start definitely with the student's strengths and identify the routines where the problem behaviors occur. Then after that, we've identified that, we then do the second part, usually the back page. I print it out front and back, usually. And then we focus on those prioritized routines. And then come up with a summary for that. So you guys see that on page 20, right? The facts forms. And some common, frequently asked questions that are covered within the training is, how long does it take to conduct a facts interview? Well, typically, we teach that it takes 30 to 45 minutes. So budget out that time to spend with that teacher. Whom should they interview? Well, the referring teacher, somebody who's going to know about what's going on there. Okay? What materials do you need for conducting the facts? Well, we teach the idea that you have one for you, and one, because there's a lot on that page, one for the teacher or the person that you're interviewing to follow along, so they can kind of see. Okay? And common practice, I don't know if you guys have seen this before, but some people say, well, can I just drop this interview in the teacher's box and they can fill it out? And we say no, because we need to guide them along and ask those follow-up questions that you're so well trained to do. Okay? So do not just drop it in their box, because you're going to have to redo it anyway. Okay? So the part A of the facts on page 20 is we're going to ask the staff, and we're thinking of what the routines are and prioritizing those routines, because with the expectation that we're going to go ahead and see this. So think about, you're setting yourself up for an observation here. If it's not clear, you're going to be in trouble for that observation, right? So you want to be that investigator that needs to be convinced that you can go ahead and see this. And so that's how we teach it, okay? So we're narrowing the focus, kind of like the analogy of looking under the hood of a car, and we teach that part. Then we walk through, and after asking those strengths-based questions, we look at the routines. So what is the student's schedule? What is the activity going on? What is the likelihood of problem behavior occurring in that activity? What is the specific problem behavior that occurs in that activity? And is there currently some kind of intervention going on? And asking that throughout the student's scheduled day. Then, so this kind of parses that out, and you practice going through these activities with the participants and get them to see, okay, well, great. So we've gotten some great information here. There's a couple of 6s, and we teach the rule if it's 4 or above, we think of that as a priority. Okay? If it's 4 or below, we're not going to worry about that one too much. We're going to focus on the 5s and 6s. Okay? And we teach then, we look at the routines here. So activity 1, you'll see on page 24 and 25, we actually practice doing tracing. And so there's a script for the participants to follow. And then they work with their partner, and they just answer just the first part, the student strengths and filling out the schedule. They just stop there, and then we review, and we see, well, what did you get for Tracy? Okay, and he should have got something like this based on the script and what your partner said. And then we go to the next step of prioritizing. And so now we're going to prioritize those routines. So if it's a 4 or above, or 4, 5, or 6, we look at the routines, and we select between 1 to 2 routines that we're going to prioritize. The second part of our training, okay? We also teach the rule, because remember, we're thinking of students with mild to moderate problem behaviors. If there's more than 2 routines, it might be a bigger problem. So that might be a good time to talk to your behavior specialist and say, this kid's doing this all day, and it's actually a major deal. I thought it was going to be a simpler FBA, but it looks a little bit more complicated. And so we teach them to think that way. They can continue with the process, but they might want to notify people that they might need some help at this point. Okay? So for part B, they prioritize those routines. Or sorry, before we get to part B, they look at those routines and those problem behaviors. They then really define that problem behavior, make sure they got it down, because remember, they're going to observe this and have the top 3. We make sure that we ask these questions of what's the frequency of the problem behavior, the duration, how long does that problem behavior occur, and is it an immediate danger to self or others? And again, if it's yes, that's where we might want to tell Mr. or Mrs. Behavior Specialist to come and help us out. And we're also prompting them to ask, to prioritize the routine and the problem behaviors for part B. Okay, so we go from here and we teach all of these components using our scripts for Tracy and Shane. And then we teach them how to then go to the next part and ask about the antecedents, so what happens immediately before the problem behavior, what is the activity, what peers, what tasks. If they have a hard time with that, we teach them how to think of, well, if I wanted to set up Tracy to do this problem behavior, what would I need to do? Who would I put next to her? Okay? Or if I presented peers that are popular next to her 10 times, how many times will she tease them, or whatever it is? Okay? So to really help the teacher, sometimes they can't quite think of, well, I'm not sure when the student engages in the problem behavior. But we do teach that we have them identify as many antecedents as they see, but we then rank what are the highest probables. And then, of course, we make sure that we follow up, and we teach them, and we practice through using the scripts to ask those follow-up questions of, looks like task too hard was number 1. You need to ask, what is that demand in detail? And so, writing sentences and paragraphs and journals, etc. Okay? Number 2 was independent work. Describe what that really is, and we teach them how to ask those questions in that way. Okay? And we do that for the consequences, and we do that for the setting events. And we walk through each of those pieces to finally come up with the hypothesis statement. So they copy and paste, not so much if you don't have a computer, but if you're doing it by hand, you basically plug these things in, kind of like doing your taxes, and then ask on a scale of 1 to 6, how likely is this occurring because of this? Does that make sense? And it teaches them each of those steps on how to do that. We're at about break time. So what I want you guys to do is for the next about 90 seconds, take a look at these 2 forms, the page 20 and page 21. And of course, you've probably been looking at it already. So if you have any questions about the first 2 sessions or the forms or anything, in the afternoon, you guys are going to look at these more closely and have a plan to train on these. So we'll have more time to really engage with those. But I'm kind of giving you, again, kind of a quick and dirty for all these pieces. Any questions about pages 20 to 21 and the interview form or parts 1 and 2? No? All right. Well, then why don't we go ahead and take our break? And I think it's until 11. Great. Well, enjoy your break. please feel free to come and ask questions during that break. Thanks.